Carlos Marcello sat around a circular table at his most trusted estate, Churchill Farms. This location, situated in the middle of nowhere, was heavily guarded. To get there, one had to pass numerous guards who not only monitored who came and went, but also maintained the vast property 24/7. The terrain itself posed a significant challenge. Navigating it without using the main road was nearly impossible. This property, located in the middle of nowhere, was shrouded in rumors and speculation, particularly concerning what transpired there after Carlos Marcello's return from Guatemala. Upon his forced deportation and subsequent return, Marcello was enraged. Contrary to some accounts, he couldn't storm around the office, throwing things due to broken ribs and other injuries sustained while trying to get back to America. His return journey through the treacherous jungles nearly killed him. Many people are unaware that Carlos Marcello grew up in the remote bayous. A farmer's son by birth and the oldest in his family, he learned to navigate those challenging environments from a young age. In the early 1900s, navigating the bayous was no easy feat. Marcello was entrusted with pushing his father's cart all the way to the market. This journey through the tough environment was extremely tough, yet it made him the man he was. It was at Churchill Farms, this secluded and heavily guarded property, that one of the most ruthless mob bosses in American history is said to have uttered words that would later be seen as predicting the assassination of John F. Kennedy. The farm would go down in history as a place holding many secrets, some of which may have altered the course of history. Throughout history, there have been powerful mob bosses and reigning crime families, but emerging from the Prohibition era was one man who forged a criminal syndicate so formidable it reshaped American and world history. Charlie Luciano, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino, Tommy Lucchese, and many others were pivotal figures in the realm of organized crime. Yet, while Frank Costello's capabilities were chilling, he stood out as a political kingmaker. He was the mastermind behind Tammany Hall and the trusted ally Luciano turned to for corrupting every high-ranking police commissioner in New York. Costello was a genius who executed Luciano's plans with surgical precision. As the 30s dawned, these men were instrumental in elevating Franklin D. Roosevelt to the presidency, arguably making him one of the greatest American leaders. Frank Costello didn't just sow corruption throughout New York. When Roosevelt turned against organized crime, Costello expanded his operations to the south. This move heralded the rise of another formidable figure, Carlos Marcello. Marcello, one of America's most ruthless mob bosses, transformed the mafia landscape by the 60s. These men were no longer mere political kingmakers. They were toppling governments both domestically and internationally. Guatemala, Cuba, and Latin American countries witnessed the overthrow of governments by the CIA, now intertwined with organized crime under the Dulles brothers' leadership at the Central Intelligence Agency. Carlos Marcello emerged as the godfather of the United States, a title he earned through years of unchallenged dominance. For over 15 years he ruled Louisiana, extending his crime family's influence across the South. He conquered various regions, including Texas, with its major cities of Austin, El Paso, Dallas, and Houston falling under his control. An infamous saying about Marcello encapsulated his power. Carlos Marcello needs a fix in municipal court, like Rockefeller needs to steal pennies. Marcello was the embodiment of power and the ultimate problem solver in the criminal underworld. To understand the power of organized crime, one must grasp the political influence these men wielded. They played a crucial role in bringing Franklin D. Roosevelt to the White House. After Roosevelt, Harry S. Truman also had strong ties to the world of organized crime. Truman brought in the Dulles brothers, further entrenching these connections. Following Truman, Eisenhower and then Nixon came into power. Nixon had particularly strong ties to organized crime, especially with the Teamsters and Carlos Marcello. Nixon's close friends were heavily connected to Marcello and Tony Provenzano. Moving into the 60s, These connections paved the way for the Kennedy administration, a game-changer in the political landscape. Carlos Marcello initially opposed Kennedy's presidency. However, influential mobsters like Sam Giancana, Russell Bufalino, and Santo Trafficante, along with some key New York mobsters, convinced Marcello to support John F. Kennedy. This support came after the Kennedy camp signaled its backing of the Bay of Pigs invasion. This information swayed organized crime to support Kennedy's run for the White House. Consequently, in 1961, John F. Kennedy became the first Irish Catholic president of America. However, the honeymoon period was short-lived. In April, the war on organized crime began when Robert F. Kennedy was sworn in as Attorney General. Within 2 weeks, Carlos Marcello was picked up and deported to Guatemala. Shortly after, the Bay of Pigs invasion took place, resulting in a disastrous defeat for the Cuban exiles. This failure sent shockwaves across the globe and led to a minor uprising in Guatemala, where Marcello was trying to navigate through bribery. The failed invasion caused Castro and the Guatemalan government to blame Marcello, leading to his capture and deportation. He eventually resurfaced in America and took legal action against the Kennedy administration for his illegal deportation. On the day President Kennedy was assassinated, Carlos Marcello won his case against Robert F. Kennedy. He walked out of court victorious, believing he had not only beaten Robert F. Kennedy, but also played a role in the assassination of his brother, though his plan had veered off course. There were multiple plans for the day of the assassination, but only one was meant to unfold. This plan involved Oswald carrying out the assassination and then being silenced by corrupt police officers. However, Oswald managed to escape the Texas school book depository, make it home, change clothes, and grab a gun, aware of the dangerous people he worked for and the protection he needed. A police vehicle was supposed to be stationed outside his house to pick him up if he escaped. But when Oswald's description was broadcast on the radio, the officers outside his home, honking twice as a signal, made a hasty retreat. By the time Oswald left his house, the officers were gone. This was witnessed by his landlady, who provided statements to corroborate this. Had those officers stayed, they would have taken Oswald to a remote location and killed him, making it look like a shootout. However, once his description was aired, the officers knew Oswald was too hot to handle and fled. Oswald, now on foot, mistook Officer Tippett's vehicle for his intended getaway car. Realizing his mistake only after a brief exchange with Tippett, Oswald quickly shot and killed the officer, even ensuring his death with a shot to the head. Calls flooded police stations, alerting them to the officer's murder. Officers from the assassination site rushed to the scene while Oswald slipped away, eventually being arrested in a cinema. His behavior there was suspicious. He approached several people, presenting a torn dollar bill, a known espionage signal where each party has half of the bill to confirm their identity. When Oswald was arrested, the torn note was found in his wallet. Carlos Marcello was furious, but had a contingency plan. Jack Ruby, a known mobster, assassinated Oswald, ensuring that any links Oswald had would die with him. It would take years for the authorities and the American public to grasp the extent of Carlos Marcello's power in Dallas and Texas. Dallas was practically Marcello's satellite state, with influence rivaling his power in New Orleans. Marcello's reach extended beyond the streets, infiltrating various levels of political power. This article you are about to hear was written in the 70s and highlights the immense power Carlos Marcello wielded. Although brief, this article serves as a preview of the subject that inspired me to start this channel. My goal is to explain the influence of Southern organized crime, its political corruption, and how it shaped America. After the Kennedy administration, Lyndon B. Johnson took the White House, followed by Richard Nixon, who again represented the South. After Nixon came President Ford, then Jimmy Carter, the last president to openly meet with the head of the Teamsters. Ronald Reagan, known for his stance against organized crime in New York and elsewhere. was ironically aligned with Southern organized crime. Despite Carlos Marcello's fall during Reagan's presidency, he was released by someone close to Marcello and his crime family, George Bush Sr. George Bush Sr. would later become president in the 90s. Another president from the South was Bill Clinton, hailing from Arkansas, a state deeply connected with Marcello. Following Clinton was George Bush Jr., son of George Bush Sr., who also maintained friendships with Carlos Marcello's son and various other Southern Mafia families. This channel aims to delve into the power of the Southern Mafia, its political ties, and the extent of their influence. This involves the Central Intelligence Agency, the FBI, and various other government agencies that were heavily intertwined with organized crime. Organized crime migrates to the Sun Belt. By William Inman, United Press International. It was a warm Delta night, and October rains pounded the cobbled pavements of Girod Street, when 5 men emerged from the glow of a street lamp and shot David Hennessy. The reformist police chief of New Orleans died 10 hours later in Charity Hospital, never sure who attacked him or why. But the citizens of New Orleans felt they knew. So, when a jury acquitted a handful of Sicilian suspects, a committee of 50, actually a mob of 20,000, swarmed down Canal Street to the muddy yard of the parish prison and systematically shot or bludgeoned 11 innocent men to death. The next day, the New Orleans Picayune argued the work done was a marvel of moderation and predicted the threat from obscure criminal conspirators who called themselves mafiosi, a new word in the American vocabulary, was wiped from the continent. That was 90 years ago. For more than half a century, the business of organized crime, the activities of the nation's 26 traditional mafia families and the less visible but allied organized groups, shifted to the big cities of the Northeast and industrial Midwest. But experts insist that starting in the last decade, these criminals have migrated southward in unprecedented numbers and begun to adapt their trade to the expanding opportunities of the Sun Belt. "These guys are simply businessmen who followed the money," said Jack Key, organized crime specialist for the Senate Subcommittee on Investigations. "The big-time hoods are setting up operations in the Sun Belt, and the public, the news media, and the business world really haven't awakened to that fact. In fact, the move is a logical phase in corporate crime's growth. If you were a big businessman and wanted to maximize your profits, would you move your plant to Detroit or Cleveland or New York?" asked Tom Urban, former Internal Revenue Service criminal investigator, now a management advisor to oil companies. "No, you'd come down to Tulsa or Houston, San Antonio or Dallas, or the dozens of other boom cities in the region," he said. "Then you'd look around to tailor your operation to suit the territory. Instead of loan sharking or running a small-time numbers racket in a ghetto, the new corporate mobster would wear a 3-piece suit and sell oil on the underground market or get involved in computers or sports gambling." To evaluate organized crime's penetration in this region's marketplace, UPI interviewed scores of law enforcement officials and pored through stacks of congressional testimony and investigative files, some previously undisclosed. The findings show organized crime operations, including narcotics trafficking and gambling, grossed more than $32 billion last year in the states of Texas, Missouri, Kansas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Colorado, and New Mexico, or more than a fifth of the estimated $150 billion collected annually by the mob and its associates in the U.S. The $32 billion is an increase of more than 100% compared to the estimated $15 billion collected a decade ago. It is the biggest jump of any multi-state region in the nation. The untaxed profits from those revenues, roughly a third of the gross, in this region is more than the federal government's entire $4.7 billion budget for crime fighting and the administration of justice. Mob money has bankrolled several legitimate businesses in the region, including multi-million-dollar hotels and real estate developments. The funds often were channeled through dummy corporations, foreign investors, or unwitting intermediaries such as union pension trustees. The cases of arson have skyrocketed in the last decade in the region's major cities, and they have been linked to organized crime. San Antonio, for instance, had a 1,000% increase in arson in 7 years. In addition, the rate of motor vehicle thefts has increased dramatically in the region, and lawmakers say it is related to the international criminal bartering system. The word mafia comes from an Italian dialect and means manliness and beauty. It once described an underground patriotic organization in Sicily, but was corrupted in America to refer to a secret body of criminals united by family and economic interests. FBI Director William Webster estimates the traditional mafia, or La Cosa Nostra, translated Our Thing, consists of 2,000 hardcore members. Police figures indicate about 500 hardcore members and 5,000 associates practice or live in the 8-state region. Below the mafia in the criminal hierarchy are regional organizations such as the so-called Dixie Mafia, a loosely connected band of traveling thieves in the south, and networks of drug traffickers such as Mexico's Herrera family, which supplies much of the nation's brown heroin through a Texas-Chicago connection. These groups know each other and often work together. Say a man with the mob in Louisiana wants a piece of gas equipment from Oklahoma, said Aaron Cohn, former director of the New Orleans Crime Commission and aide to J. Edgar Hoover. He'd call a corrupt businessman in Denver who calls a friend in Oklahoma City, and the deal would be consummated. None of the men may personally know one another, but the deed was done through contacts. In recent congressional hearings, the FBI identified 5 mafia headquarter cities in the region: Denver, Dallas, St. Louis, Kansas City, and New Orleans. The FBI identified a 6th nearby, Tucson, Arizona, which has an effect on the 8 southwestern states. But agency officials caution that virtually all metropolitan areas in the region showed signs of increased organized crime influence. Organized crime in the Sunbelt covers a variety of illegal and legal businesses, including bookmaking, loan sharking, gambling, prostitution, trucking, and produce. The new corporate mobsters, unlike their predecessors, wear 3-piece suits and engage in sophisticated criminal activities such as selling oil on the underground market, getting involved in computers, or sports gambling, making them harder to detect and combat. The wages of sin were good in Bernalillo County, New Mexico, where a young woman could make $1,700 in a 17-hour shift. But the dues for those women at Thomas Charity's Aquarius Club north of Albuquerque were far from charitable. Charity, the head of a network of massage and sex parlors, dubbed companionship studios and rap parlors in Arkansas, Missouri, New Mexico, and West and Central Texas, expected his cut. Besides being drugged, electronically bugged, threatened, and sexually abused, the girls were expected to give Charity $12,000 weekly, his portion from the small business operating out of a double-sized mobile home. That amounted to $624,000 a year. Charity, now wanted on a felony prostitution warrant in Joplin, Missouri, is an example of the new breed of organized criminals moving into the region's marketplace. Charity's operations are emblematic of a larger trend where vice moguls exploit loose laws and weak enforcement in the Sunbelt. These criminals have adapted their activities to take advantage of the booming economy and rapid population growth in the region. The Justice Department has decided to go ahead with charges against congressmen found to be cocaine users, although authorities normally ignore users and concentrate on dealers. Califano refused to discuss whether the lawmakers should be prosecuted. Both Republican and Democratic leaders assured Califano that "I will have the independence, the authority, and the resources needed to carry out the investigation," he said. "They have asked me to complete the investigation as expeditiously as possible, but no time limit has been set. The overriding objective will be to conduct the investigation carefully and thoroughly, Califano said. We will spare no effort to bring the facts to the committee and the House, he said. Califano was an outspoken cabinet member under Jimmy Carter, serving as health secretary, and a White House aide to Lyndon Johnson. His Washington protégés include former White House Chief of Staff and Secretary of State Alexander Haig. Ethics Chairman Louis Stokes, Democrat Ohio, said the choice of Califano was unanimous and made with no partisanship nor any thought of political advantage. This is a non-partisan, bipartisan matter, said Reverend Floyd Spence of South Carolina, the ranking Republican member. Califano will have the same special powers given to investigators in the probe of wrongdoing in the Abscom affair that resulted in the indictment of 7 members of Congress. In addition to the Ethics Committee, which began looking into the allegations 2 weeks ago, a special task force has been appointed by House Speaker Thomas O'Neill of Massachusetts to decide whether to reform or abandon the Page system. Califano said his law firm, Califano, Ross and Heinemann, will charge the committee $100 an hour for time by its partners and $75 an hour for the time of its junior lawyers. He said that was substantially below the going rate for his firm. In Bernalillo County and beyond, organized crime has found fertile ground in the Sun Belt, exploiting lax regulations and the rapid economic development of the region. The new breed of mobsters like Thomas Charity are capitalizing on the booming economy to expand their illicit activities, demonstrating the need for robust law enforcement and regulatory measures to curb their influence. A brace of helicopters churned overhead, and Coast Guard cutters splashed alongside the sleek ocean liner jammed with slot machines and hundreds of passengers yearning for a weekend of fun and easy profit. The ship was seized quickly that bright September morning and escorted back to the port of Galveston, where it had been left in such a panic that it stranded its captain on the wharf. Once the vessel was in custody, its illicit cargo was confiscated, one of the largest gambling hauls in Texas history. At last, authorities felt they had stopped the profitable cruise junkets and the big money they suspected, but never proved poured into the coffers of organized crime. We felt really good about the capture, said Tim James, a Houston police counsel who was chief of the state's organized crime division then. We felt we had the ship's owners cold, and we did. The slot machines were sold. The ship's owners, who lacked a state business license, were forced to pay several days' dock and maintenance fees, roughly $23,000 a day for the vessel. But that was it. No other violations were found. The ship was returned to its owners and is on gambling cruises today, more than 5 years after the seizure. Even the slot machines, James learned, found their way back to the same vessel. Moreover, the ship's American owners complained, lodging formal protests with the United Nations, the U.S. Secretary of State, the President of Panama, where the vessel was registered, the U.S. Coast Guard, and Texas officials. The seizure was an act by an illegal armed force, they claimed, and was a serious breach of international law. In the wake of the protests, a state law was enacted, making it virtually impossible for police to board a ship in search of gambling equipment. It certainly is frustrating, to say the least, James said. Law enforcement authorities throughout the region bitterly complain of similar frustrations: vague or non-existent organized crime statutes, dwindling funds, and public apathy. Colorado's crime-fighting efforts are in disarray after charges that a former official of the organized crime strike force took money to keep silent about the drug habit of a powerful newspaper editor. Kansas has shifted its enforcement focus from organized crime to carnival fraud. Oklahoma and Arkansas do not have statewide organized crime task forces. Anti-crime units in major Missouri and Louisiana cities have been crippled by heavy cuts in federal and local financing. And Texas has dropped the Attorney General's organized crime division in favor of a war on drug abuse. But the criminals have become stronger and more efficient. Tom Urban, a former Internal Revenue Service criminal investigator, and now a specialist in corporate management at Texas A&M, said the infrastructure and operations of the region's booming crime outfits are increasingly like those of big corporations. The very definition of organized crime is why it is so successful, Urban said. Take an individual out of the organization and it continues. Somebody is ready to step in. The conviction of New Orleans' Carlos Marcello, or imprisonment of El Paso's Jimmy Chagra, simply shifts positions around within the hierarchy, but leaves the organization intact. A big-time criminal has many of the same advantages of a business executive, Urban said. He's gone to school, prison, to learn his trade. He gets paid well and has plenty of fringe benefits. The best lawyer when he is in trouble, health and accident coverage, top job assignments, plenty of crime protection. Traditional mafia families, such as those in Kansas City or New Orleans, have a chart of organizations similar to those of corporations. At the top is the boss or president with a counselor or company attorney, then the underboss or executive vice president, the captains or division executives, and finally the soldiers or staff members. A major crime syndicate often links up with other underworld associates, certain motorcycle gangs, narcotics traffickers, or corrupt politicians to execute a job for mutual gain, in much the same way a legitimate corporate developer seeks the help of local real estate agents, architects, and contractors to plan and build an office complex. Crime syndicates also distribute franchises. Crime's franchises existed a long time before McDonald's came about, Urban said. With all this organization and growing strength, officials have succeeded in passing 3 federal laws that may give them the authority they need to slow this growth. They are the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations, RICO, statute, the Continuing Criminal Enterprise, CCE statute, and the Bank Secrecy Act. All are aimed at depriving crime of its financial base. RICO and the CCE have been used successfully in Louisiana, Missouri, and Texas to deprive mobsters and narcotics traffickers of their gains. The state simply confiscates loot taken illegally. The Bank Secrecy Act, used effectively in Texas and Oklahoma, requires financial institutions to report unusual currency transactions in excess of $10,000 and the international transport of money in excess of $5,000. A big loophole, officials admit, is that wire-transferred money coming in from foreign banks is not reported, encouraging criminals to set up dummy corporations and bank accounts abroad. Regional experts predict that organized crime, if left unhindered, eventually will grow more powerful than the local or state governments charged with controlling it. In the words of Philip Heyman, an assistant U.S. Attorney General, "We are not fighting individual criminals, we are fighting a criminal society." The future of crime control in the Sun Belt depends on the effectiveness of these laws and the willingness of state and local governments to prioritize the battle against organized crime. The challenge is formidable, but the potential consequences of inaction are even more dire. The changes occurring in the Southern Mafia during the 70s were significant, yet many people are unaware of their extensive power in various industries. The Southern Mafia was influential not only in gambling and entertainment, but also in real estate, oil speculation, money laundering, and numerous other fraudulent schemes. They were major power players, and to this day many people don't realize the extent of their influence during that time. While the power of the 5 families in New York is widely known, with numerous films and books highlighting their captains and maid members, the Southern Mafia operated with a level of secrecy that remains unmatched. Unlike the New York or Chicago mafias, the Southern Mafia's members and structure were shrouded in mystery. Few knew the identities of all the members or the number of captains in Carlos Marcello's team. This secrecy was intentional. The less you knew, the safer you were. Dallas and the state of Texas were firmly under organized crime's control, akin to the New York Mafia's grip on parts of New York. Carlos Marcello wielded significant power over Dallas. When President Kennedy arrived in Dallas in November 1963, The city's police and political infrastructure were deeply corrupted by the Southern Mafia. They were heavily involved in narcotics trafficking and corruption, buying politicians, including Senator Johnson, who was financially supported by the Southern Mafia. Kennedy was unaware that Texas was under Marcello's control. Who knew of Kennedy's visit and the exact route he would take a week before the assassination? Marcello's network included Cuban exiles who were third-party contractors for the CIA, such as the DRE, a far-right Cuban exile group opposed to Kennedy. Oswald was associated with this group, which was supported by organized crime figures like Carlos Marcello and Santo Traficante. The DRE, based in New Orleans and Miami, had interactions with Oswald, including public altercations that were part of a larger act. My focus is increasingly on the power of the Southern Mafia, emphasizing their control in Louisiana, Florida, Miami, New Orleans, Dallas, and other areas like Arkansas and Missouri. One dangerous criminal syndicate that operated like a mercenary group or a mafia, yet more akin to a group of redneck gangsters capable of professional-level crimes, was the Dixie Mafia. These men were heavily trained and extremely capable with weapons, having grown up around guns and knowing how to defend themselves. In the South, where everyone carried a gun, challenging someone was risky. The South was known for many criminal syndicates, some rumored, some speculated, and some well-known. Among the most infamous was the Dixie Mafia. These men were not afraid to kill judges, politicians, or police officers, anyone who got in their way. Even in the 1980s, while other criminal syndicates across America were losing power and avoiding high-profile targets, the Dixie Mafia remained undeterred. They did not care about your position or influence. If you were a threat, you were eliminated. The Dixie Mafia played a significant role in the South's criminal landscape. They were known as Carlos Marcello's muscle, particularly in the 1960s. Marcello, a prominent crime boss, frequently hired them to maintain control over his rackets. He utilized rednecks and black gangsters to front his operations, providing a layer of anonymity for the Italian mobsters in the background. This tactic ensured that when FBI agents or other authorities investigated organized crime in New Orleans, they encountered only rednecks and black gangsters, diverting attention away from the true orchestrators. The Biloxi murders, specifically, involved the Dixie Mafia in a high-profile case where the organization was responsible for the deaths of Vincent Sherry, a judge, and his wife Margaret, in 1987. The murders were orchestrated by members of the Dixie Mafia as part of a scheme to control illegal activities and silence those who threatened their operations. The Dixie Mafia's history is a fascinating piece of the South's criminal past. Their capabilities and ruthless efficiency made them a formidable force, and their story offers a gripping insight into a darker side of American history. This article delves into their history, capabilities, and influence, providing a comprehensive look at this infamous criminal syndicate. All in family? Dixie Mafia. Not Mafia, It's Not Even Real, gang by Jim Stewart. In underworld slang, Kirkman Nix was a contract man. He killed for money, according to police in the Southeast. Another specialist, an alarm expert who could bypass the most complicated security systems money can buy, sometimes worked with a second burglar. Together they earned a grudging admiration from authorities for their expertise. Nix, an Oklahoman, was sentenced to life in a Louisiana prison for murder. The other two have served time for burglary and now face indictments on more than a dozen counts each of burglary in Fulton County. The three would probably be surprised to learn that police consider them fraternity brothers of a sort. In the eyes of the law, they belong to a disjointed organization called the Dixie Mafia, which has no headman, structure, or rules, and whose nomadic members are seldom aware of their status in it. In fact, the Dixie Mafia is not a mafia at all, only a title given to a conglomeration of Southern criminals who find it wiser to stay on the move in these days of electronic law enforcement. they are a newspaper creation. Tagged the Dixie Mafia by a Dallas, Texas, reporter in 1968, the concept began drawing increased interest from police after authorities from several southern states started comparing notes and discovered that many of the same criminals were popping up with startling frequency. From Atlanta to Dallas to Miami, the names and faces began to blend into a recognizable picture. Authorities needed a name for this clique, and Dixie Mafia was as good as any. Their pattern of crime was hit and run. A local man would set up the job and then import the appropriate experts. The target was normally a bank, clothing store, warehouse, or loan company. After the crime, the money was split, and everyone scattered to a different state, often being flown out by friends who had private pilot licenses. It was this mobility that surprised police. Before, organized crime had a certain homemade, folksy quality about it that police could understand and usually control. 5 years ago, Mayor Ivan Allen Jr. described it like this: the organized crime leaders in Atlanta were concerned with only their respective corner of the block, dealing in terms of nickel and dime lottery tickets or $5 jugs of homemade whiskey, and were leery of anybody who was not a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Georgian. Now it's different. Henry Hewitt, a special investigator for Fulton County District Attorney Lewis Slayton, has a bank of files devoted to the Dixie Mafia, which read like a shopping list of crimes. It is matched by similar files in other southern states, which all point out the recurring ease with which southern criminals now change their locales, crimes, and accomplices. Lieutenant H.R. Hancock, a longtime Dixie Mafia watcher with the Dallas Police Department, pointed out this new mobility, which stymies investigations. On March 27 of this year, there was a burglary at Maury's gift shop in Jackson, Miss, in which a load of expensive men's clothing was taken. Later that night, police arrested 3 men who were carrying luggage identical to some taken from the shop. All 3 were big-timers in the Dixie Mafia, Hancock said. One was William Huddleston, who had served time for burglary and theft by taking in 1971 in Georgia. Another was Jimmy Ray Graves, who operated out of Dallas, and the third was Ronald Smith, who is usually found in Arkansas. Huddleston's wife had departed for Atlanta before the law arrived, but was traced to Miami and later to South Carolina. When the Mississippi police searched Huddleston's car, they found a radio scanner tuned to police channels and some transmitters of the type used for short-distance communication. In the trunk, they also found some clothing stolen the week before from a Memphis store, Hancock said. When the 3 were released on bond, Huddleston returned to Atlanta. Smith dropped from sight, and Graves showed up in Kansas, where he was jailed for burglary of a safe. He later was charged with the murder of an army sergeant who had witnessed an armory being robbed in Louisiana. The point here is that in talking about only 4 people in the space of a few days, we've traced their activities across 9 states. It takes organization and teamwork to move that often and that fast, Hancock said. What's the difference then between the Dixie Mafia and the more infamous Godfather families headquartered on the East Coast? Discipline, says Hewitt. The Cosa Nostra is regimented like an army, and they never take on anything unless the top man knows about it. They're disciplinarians, and the Dixie Mafia are anything but. The Cosa Nostra, as authorities now know it, is efficiently divided into families, regiments, and territories with an established chain of command. While burglaries and robberies are the mainstay of the Dixie Mafia, they are frowned upon by the Cosa Nostra, who prefer organized gambling, prostitution, drugs, and legitimate business fronts to invest their earnings in. With increasing frequency, however, the Dixie Mafia and the Cosa Nostra have been crossing paths and intermingling their activities. A local man with stolen goods may fence them through a Cosa Nostra dealer. Gambling rings managed by the Dixie Mafia may turn to their better-financed counterparts to cover a large wager. In return, the Cosa Nostra uses local talent to do the legwork involved in laying bets. So, while individuals may be pegged as Cosa Nostra or Dixie Mafia, their activities are not so easily labelled. Crime is crime, whoever commits it, and it is only natural that these two underworld factions would have a vague partnership, if for no other reason than a practical business arrangement. Slayton, who set up a special intelligence division 18 months ago to study organised crime, is convinced, however, that the Dixie Mafia has no links with the Cosa Nostra. "I think the only real mafiosi we have in Atlanta are the small-timers. They may have connections to New York and Detroit, but they themselves are far down the line," Slayton said. "But if they ever did decide to make a real effort here, the Dixie Mafia would provide some fertile recruiting ground. These local boys have plenty of muscle and artillery, so it would make good sense to talk to them. But right now, they're about as far apart as they can get." Hiwot thinks the first feeler from the East Coast may have come in the person of Tommy Gambidora in 1969. Gambidora tried to set up a credit card ring, but was arrested and served a sentence here before returning to the Colombo family in New York. He was later gunned down on a sidewalk there when Colombo began warring with some of the other families. Two other Cosa Nostra soldiers with Atlanta ties have met similar fates. McKinley Rogers and Donald Phillips, who police think staged the hold-up of a celebration party on Handy Drive after the Muhammad Ali Jerry quarry fight here in 1970, were found murdered a year later in the Bronx. Killing is a common denominator between the Dixie Mafia and the Cosa Nostra. It is a business tool for both, but rarely used on each other, simply because at present they don't have conflicting interests. But even in homicide, they differ. For example, in 1970, detectives discovered the body of Dunaway, a suspected Dixie Mafia member, stuffed in a barrel at the Atlanta airport. Police later found that Dunaway had been in Tennessee for a time, apparently hiding from the Mafia, but someone found him. The case is unsolved. Also a mystery is the death of Kenneth "Jap" Hanna, believed to be a member of the Cosa Nostra, who ended his career locked in a car trunk at the airport in 1970. The only thing investigators can agree on about Dunaway and Hanna is that they were done in by professionals. Atlanta is not the only dumping ground for bodies. In 1968, a part-time pimp and burglar from Atlanta, named L.B. Kelly, was found nude in a desert outside Denison, Texas, with 15 bullet wounds in his head and chest. A year before, another Atlanta man, Eddie Grant Lewis, was found shot in the head in a car parked on an Ohio expressway. Both were known members of the Dixie Mafia. Reports of many of the other killings read like cheap crime magazine stories. Lee Bowling, former policeman turned crook, found dead in a prostitute's apartment in 1971. The same apartment complex was later the home of Brian Gerald Haynes, a more recent victim. Leroy Kerwin, an Atlanta business executive with suspected underworld connections, found shot to death in Canada. Jack Howard Joy, who robbed a friend of New Orleans Cosa Nostra Chief Carlos Marcello and was shot to death and set aflame. Winton Farley, small-time burglar whose body was cut in half and placed in separate laundry bags in Mississippi in 1970, and Clifford B. Fitzwilliams, who was apparently still alive when handcuffed to a boat anchor and dumped into the Freeport Textor Bay. The most recent contract slayings involved an Atlanta ex-convict named Brian Gerald Haynes, whose slashed and decomposing body was found crumpled in the bottom of a North Fulton County well on May 31st. His legs were bound with adhesive tape, and there were knife wounds in his back and neck, a trademark police now know well. When a list of Haynes's friends and associates was drawn up by Slayton's office, it read like a who's who in the Dixie Mafia. 3 of them were identified by informants as having been with Haynes the day he died. Authorities are now seeking them for questioning. Speculation is that Haynes was murdered because his killers thought he was talking to the Fulton County District Attorney. The District Attorney's office admitted they had questioned Haynes when he was serving a term for a 1969 robbery conviction. He didn't talk, they said, They admitted that the underworld might have mistakenly assumed that. Haynes's death reawakened interest in the Mafia and spotlighted again one of its more colourful characters. Sonny Paris, alias Sonny Parish, whom one detective describes as a gutsy hood with the ugliest face I know. First reports had placed Sonny near the Haynes home when he disappeared, but authorities have now discounted that theory, believing that Sonny was too busy robbing banks. As bank robbers in the Dixie Mafia go, Sonny Paris is among the best, and lately he's been breaking all track records for hold-ups. His most recent exploits began in March of this year, when he was in jail again for a robbery and was taken to Hewat's office for questioning on another case. When Hewat turned his back, Sonny whipped out a long-barreled .38 caliber pistol from his boot. It was twice the size of mine, Hewat recalled. After forcing his way out of the office, Sonny reacted like an old firehorse. 10 minutes later, he was at the Mercantile National Bank, pistol in hand, declaring a stick-up. Adding insult to injury, he repeated the hold-up at the same bank the following day and yelled to tellers, "I'm the same bastard that robbed you yesterday, and I'll do it again tomorrow." He didn't, however, much to the disappointment of a small army of police waiting in ambush. Since then, Paris has remained on the move. In late May, he robbed a bank in Nashville, Tennessee, this time working with a girl accomplice who later was captured. She had a picture of Sonny in her purse, but claimed she never knew him by that name and had met him in New York. Later reports placed him in Florida, and even later in Savannah, but it wasn't until June 8th that Sonny ended the guessing game on his whereabouts by showing up donned in a wig and makeup to rob the First Bank of Georgia on Peachtree Street. With mobility like that, Paris and the rest of the Dixie Mafia have forced authorities to do a little organizing of their own. In 1968, the Southern Regional Intelligence Council was formed and met in Atlanta for the first time. Lawmen compared notes, listened to speeches, and huddled for long hours over each other's files. Because of scheduling problems, the council has not met for more than 6 months, and Hewat thinks it's about time they did. One department or even one state can't keep up with these guys. As soon as they feel the heat here, they just move someplace else. We get reports one day from Florida, and the next from Tennessee. Who knows what they're planning, he said. The next article I am going to present comes from a Dallas newspaper of the 70s, detailing organized crime's influence. A headline once stated, "The Mafia is in Texas." But the Mafia had long been entrenched there. Following the lynching after Chief Hennessy's murder, many Sicilians and Catholics from New Orleans spread out to places like Texas, establishing organized crime structures that persisted for years, either independently or under the Chicago outfit or New Orleans crime families. Dallas. The Texas Organized Crime Prevention Council is the agency established to combat the state's organized crime. Last year, the group identified 163 men in Texas as associates of Mafia members. Of these, 32 were identified as past or present members of the Mafia. Frank Dyson, director of the Austin-based State Crime Council, says, "There is no question in my mind that Texas is ripe for organized crime influence. The presence of organized crime will ultimately mean corruption, possible violence, and increased economic burden on citizens through higher taxes and higher consumer costs. The potential for organized crime is great, and we must act immediately to stem its growth." The Associated Press began its probe of organized crime with 2 days of interviews with a former Mafia leader. The fat man presided at dinner with a rough elegance born of street power and money. He spoke of the good life, good food, big cars, thoroughbred women. It was the kind of life protected in part by the .38 caliber pistol hidden beneath his red dinner napkin. The meal was delicious. The wine was excellent. But this was no clam house in Little Italy in New York City. Instead, it was a hotel club in one of Texas's largest cities, operated by the former East Coast Mafia lord. The former Mafia leader agreed to an interview with the Associated Press about Texas's organized crime, but would not allow his identity to be disclosed. In this story, his pseudonym will be Mr. Angelo. He assumed he left the Mafia behind when he came to Texas, but he soon learned the Mafia was already here, he said. Mafia men carry no membership cards, they wear no fraternal rings, and they don't give out Man of the Year awards. Generally, their names are not among directors of banks or hospitals. They can cloak their activities in legitimate businesses through which they wash, report as legal income, money earned in narcotics trade, loan sharking, prostitution, and gambling. Texas is a ripe melon. A former East Coast Mafia chieftain recently described Texas as a great big watermelon ripe for the plucking. Law enforcement officers across the state agree. Indeed, the pluckers have arrived, some on a large scale. Carlos Marcello, one of the biggest reputed underworld figures in the New Orleans area. Marcello's interests in Texas are reportedly threatened by the West Coast Mafia and others. According to Mr. Angelo, West Coast mafiosi are moving into Texas, claim jumping on a New Orleans-based family. Much of what Mr. Angelo said cannot be substantiated. If we could do that, these people would be in jail and their enterprises would be stopped, said Dyson. We are aware of some contacts between organized crime figures and some businessmen in Texas. However, we are unable to draw any conclusive inferences from these contacts in terms of illegal activities. Mr. Angelo said hoodlums are getting ready for the day when gambling is legalized in Texas. It'll come just like booze did. He said massive land holdings, mostly in West Texas, represent economic power with which the mob can finance racetracks, casinos, brothels, and clubs. Hell, you name it. But remember, the key to success is getting the right people in your pocket. You have to do it, said Mr. Angelo. Official graft. He said he was approached by a high-placed state official soon after his arrival in Texas. This guy says if the mob would put up the money and whatever to get him elected governor, he'd turn the state over to them. I'm not in that business anymore. I threw the son of a bitch out. I checked on him, though. He's already got dirty hands. He's into some pretty big drug operations. Mr. Angelo said former New York mobster Joseph Joe Bonanno, now living in Tucson, Arizona, had flown to El Paso frequently to visit his son, Joseph Charles Bonanno. The younger Bonanno was serving a federal prison term for extortion and conspiracy. He was visiting the kid, said Mr. Angelo, but he was talking business with people too. Joe's not out of action. Federal authorities confirmed young Bonanno was transferred last summer from the El Paso prison to Terminal Island, California, to complete his sentence. They confirmed that Bonanno Sr. visited frequently. Criminal organization in Texas is not new, but its proliferation is the current worry of law enforcement officers. The late Sam Maceo controlled organized crime in the Galveston area during the 40s. In those days, Galveston was a neon light on the seashore. Post Office Street was lined with bordellos. Texas Rangers, led by Clint Peoples, now a U.S. Marshal, and his wife, closed down the Macchio-owned Balinese Room Casino in the mid-50s. Asked why he hadn't done the job himself, the late Sheriff Frank Biagna dryly remarked, "They wouldn't let me in. I wasn't a member." In the early 80s, Biagio Angelica was convicted in Galveston of firebombing a clinic at nearby High Island in what authorities termed a narcotics dispute. Angelica was reputedly a mafia underling transplanted from New York to Houston. Mr. Angelo said a mafia family controls an out-of-state real estate company which operates a Texas land development company. The AP confirmed both companies existed, but was unable otherwise to corroborate Mr. Angelo's claim. Real estate visits Dallas. Mr. Angelo said the hotel's linen service also is a mafia front, reporting illicit income as legitimate income. An advertising executive who has done business with the land development company said, "Frankly, I'm afraid of them. They acted rather sinister and shady with us. We're not doing any more business with them." The executive said he too knew of a connection between the development company and the real estate firm. The late Joe Civello of Dallas was among the 63 hoods arrested in 1957 at the infamous Appalachian Conference in upstate New York. Civello, operator of a food and liquor import business, was given 5 years for conspiracy to thwart justice. Judge Irving R. Kaufman called him a high-ranking criminal who cloaked himself with the facade of legitimate business. Vacuum in Dallas. Mr. Angelo said Civello's death left a vacuum which Marcello tried to fill, but not without its consequences. Marcello was arrested in 1966 at the La Stella restaurant in Queens, New York City, at a so-called Little Appalachian Conference. With him at dinner were Carlo Gambino, Joe Colombo, since vegetabilized with a bullet in his brain, and Florida's Santo Trafficante, all well-known mafia dons. Mr. Angelo said Marcello's expansion stepped on the toes of a crime family in Dallas. "The information I have is they're getting uptight with Marcello. If he doesn't back off, there's gonna be a war." He said the Dallas family has East Coast origins, but came to Texas to establish its own mini-kingdom. Dallas police dismiss such an idea. Massage parlors, gambling, and narcotics traffic have blossomed in Dallas, San Antonio, and Houston in recent years. A prostitute at one of the Dallas parlors said her boss was a man who came around to pick up money. He carried a gun and a briefcase filled with cash. An investigation showed the man was a partner in a Dallas health club that filed for bankruptcy in Beaumont, Texas in 1972 and was not registered with the Secretary of State. "I don't think he was the real boss," the prostitute said. "But I was afraid of him. I think he delivered the money to somebody else." Only recently, the FBI in Dallas broke up what it called one of the biggest gambling networks in the nation. Police discount the likelihood of conflict between Marcello and the Dallas crime faction. At a Dallas party early last year, police observed Marcello emissaries. There were 7 or 8 guys from New Orleans, Marcello's people. "They wouldn't be so lovey-dovey if they were fixing to get it on," said a Dallas police intelligence officer. 6 men were convicted last January in Dallas of bookmaking, an operation police said grossed $2,000 a day. One of them was Anthony Paul Diodone, 52. "I knew him by another name," said Mr. Angelo. He would not elaborate. Texas Attorney General John Hill has filed a suit to halt operations in the lower Rio Grande Valley of Pelican Tomato Company, a company operated by the Marcello family. The suit was named Joseph Marcello Jr., Joseph Saldino, Paul Saldino, Jim Saldino, and Joseph A. Matassa. "I did not send a task force down there," Hill said. "In connection with our work on the Pelican Tomato case, it turned out there were mafia connections. They are no longer doing business. The 2 lawyers working on the case suggested there was some evidence of underworld figures involving themselves in real estate transactions in the Padre Island area. As soon as we find the time and the manpower, we do intend to pick up that investigation a little later and do a more exhaustive investigation than we have done to date," Hill said. Dyson said he is aware that the U.S. Department of Justice and the Texas Attorney General's office were exploring a possible connection between Carlos Marcello and various entities. Bonanno Jr. The younger Joe Bonanno is shown here before a New York grand jury appearance with his father in 1965. He'll likely inherit the Bonanno interests, which appear to include some Texas activity. Joe Bonanno, Joe Bananas, is rumored to have become interested in Texas while visiting his son when the younger Bonanno was doing time in El Paso. Mr. Angelo said New Orleans mafia kingpin Carlos Little Man Marcello is mixed up with the mafia family, itself based out of state, which has the real estate company. The connection, he said, lies in the ownership of a Dallas hotel. Dallas police confirmed that Carlos Marcello always stays at this particular hotel whenever he is in the city. Inroads in Texas could bring mob wars, warned Dyson, who noted that organized crime had squeezed a staggering $120,884,800 from bookmaking profits and another $126,984,000 from prostitution last year alone. The profits from narcotics, fencing, auto theft, pornography, and loan sharking. Further added to this illicit wealth, although the total amount of illegal profits siphoned out of state couldn't be accurately estimated due to the state's inadequate information-gathering system, he lamented. Dyson described the approach to quantifying these activities as little more than guessing. Mr. Angelo, a figure who had allegedly gone legit after severing ties with the Mafia, recently returned to his old stomping grounds after leaving Texas. Despite his claims of reform, corporate victims across Texas accuse him of swindling, defrauding, and stealing nearly $500,000 worth of goods, services, and equipment. They believe the great big watermelon of temptation lured him back into criminal activities. Former Ranger Captain Clint Peoples highlighted the dire consequences of the syndicate establishing itself in the Lone Star State. "Everyone will pay," he said, "both to keep them in business and to try to put them out of it." Carlos Marcello, a prominent Mafia figure, sometimes described himself as an investor. Despite his criminal reputation, a New Orleans judge defended their friendship, claiming they only engaged in innocent activities like barbecuing goats on a spit. "There is nothing sinister about our relationship," the judge insisted, dismissing suggestions of corruption. "Carlos Marcello needs a fix in municipal court like Rockefeller needs to steal pennies." In December, the San Antonio Express-News reported the ease of finding expensive call girls in Alamo City through the right connections, which included socially and politically prominent individuals and high-level law enforcement officers. Mr. Angelo remarked on the pervasive corruption, noting that even upper-class individuals, usually involved in legitimate ventures, were entangled in illicit activities. "They really throw their money around," he said, recounting a prominent stockbroker's attempt to move stocks through him. Reflecting on his past, Angelo mused, "If I were on the other side of the fence again, Texas would be a great big watermelon." John Hill, Texas Attorney General, continued to monitor enterprises in South Texas, which may or may not be legal, while intelligence reports from 1974 indicated a Louisiana-based Mafia family had connections with individuals in Brownsville, Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio. However, these individuals were considered associates rather than full-fledged members of the Mafia. Carlos Marcello, often referred to as the Godfather of New Orleans, exemplified the duality of mobsters' public personas. His 6,500-acre Churchill Farms estate outside New Orleans, valued at over $60 million, was a testament to his wealth and vanity. Known for both his generosity and ruthlessness, stories about Marcello included gifts of $10,000 to a Girl Scout cookie seller and $100,000 to hurricane victims, while his daughter's wedding saw each bridesmaid receiving a mink stole from the little man. Dyson's warnings painted a picture of a state on the brink, where the allure of vast illegal profits and the spectre of organized crime loomed large. The next articles I'm about to present date back to the time when Carlos Marcello began his inevitable downfall. Marcello had become increasingly overconfident, failing to recognize the changing environment around him. With the days of J. Edgar Hoover behind, a new generation of FBI agents emerged, eager to make names for themselves. They set their sights on the most untouchable Mafia bosses, and Carlos Marcello, the Kingfish of New Orleans, became their prime target. The FBI needed an elaborate plan to bring down Marcello, but in the end, it wasn't just their intelligence that led to his downfall. Instead, it was a man seeking an escape from his dire situation who handed the FBI a bigger fish: Carlos Marcello. Marcello was eventually imprisoned, although not for long. While incarcerated, he continued to run his empire from his cell, focusing on influencing the next presidential administration. His goal was to have George Bush Sr. in office, believing it would facilitate his release from prison, which ultimately occurred. The following articles detail Marcello's power, his rise, and his inevitable fall. They also discuss other crime families collaborating with the New Orleans Mafia and their power dynamics. This period marked the final curtain call for the old-timer Mafia pioneers. The new generation could not replicate their predecessors' success due to the FBI's intensified efforts and crackdowns on political corruption. This article delves into the history surrounding Carlos Marcello and the city of Dallas, particularly considering the context of President Kennedy's assassination, which occurred just 14 years prior. At that time, organized crime in Dallas was rarely discussed. However, Jack Ruby, who would later assassinate Lee Harvey Oswald, was known to associate with prominent figures in organized crime in Dallas, including Joe Campisi. Days before the assassination, Ruby was seen dining with Campisi and other members of the criminal underworld in Dallas. Similarly, Oswald was spotted in various restaurants in both New Orleans and Dallas, establishments connected to organized crime, including Jack Ruby's nightclub. Another critical aspect to consider is that Joe Civello, the mob boss, visited Jack Ruby within hours of Ruby assassinating Oswald. This article explores the broader historical context and the hidden connections between these events, shedding light on what was happening behind the scenes and what was being covered up. The Big Little Man of Louisiana is Fond of Food, Political Power by Bill Rose, Herald staff writer. A Neapolitan love song blared from the tape deck of the big gold Cadillac as it rolled up Interstate 10 toward Lafayette, Louisiana, with Cosa Nostra boss Carlos Marcello at the wheel. Marcello, 71, a 5'2" white-haired grandfather known to organized crime associates as the Big Little Man, felt compelled to translate for his passengers. "They're saying, 'Stay with me tonight,'" Marcello explained in his deep, gravelly voice. His passengers smiled appreciatively. He knew them as Prudential insurance representatives willing to pay bribes to snare a lucrative state insurance contract. For once, the man the FBI describes as one of the shrewdest crime bosses in America was wrong. His passengers were two undercover FBI agents and the glib, persuasive Joseph Hauser, a former Miami insurance executive and twice convicted swindler turned government informant. In the agent's briefcase, a tiny microphone recorded every word. Two more mics, hidden in the ceiling of Marcello's suburban New Orleans office, and another in his home, also were busy. For much of the last 14 weeks of his trial in U.S. District Court here, Marcello, one of the most secretive crime bosses in the country, has held his head in his hands and occasionally shut his eyes as tape after tape of his private conversations in late 1979 and early 1980 was played in open court. The tapes, prosecution lawyers contend, show Marcello and the fake insurance executives plotting to bribe a number of Louisiana politicians to grab a fat group insurance package. They resulted in the indictment of Marcello, then Commissioner of Administration Charles Romer, New Orleans lawyer Vincent Marinello, Washington lobbyist I. Irving Davidson, and former state official for bribery conspiracy. For the first time, they have cut through the shroud of secrecy surrounding Marcello. They have given the public a detailed look at his empire, reputed to be one of the most powerful and most entrenched in the country. They have also revealed his personal habits. He is obsessed with food. He frequents the city's best restaurants, feasting on pasta, spaghetti, steak, and fettuccine. He favors imported cigars and expensive suits. If the tapes are to be believed, Marcello's influence on state government is pervasive. He is a man with influence, publicly shunned, but privately courted by campaign fundraisers and businessmen in search of public work. "It's a political reality," said Michael Fauer, Romer's lawyer. For years, political candidates have sought Carlos Marcello's support. No one did it publicly. But in political circles, the political wisdom was that Carlos Marcello's support means votes. Until now, little has been known about Marcello outside of law enforcement reports, describing him as one of the country's most powerful mobsters. Born to a Sicilian fishing family in Tunis, North Africa, he was brought to the United States by his parents at the age of 8 months. Marcello was convicted of armed robbery at the age of 19. In 1938, he was convicted of selling marijuana. He has also been convicted of slugging an FBI agent. Some investigators suspect he played a role in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Senate investigators say he was introduced to the Louisiana gambling rackets in the 30s by Frank Costello, then built a lucrative financial empire based on slot and amusement machines, gambling, real estate, and restaurants. He was once kidnapped by U.S. immigration authorities and spirited off to Guatemala, but shortly reappeared in New Orleans. Since then, immigration officials have tried for 30 years to have him deported, a move Marcello's lawyers have thwarted with a flurry of legal and character witnesses who testify to his good character and charity. In rare public statements, Marcello has claimed he is simply an honest businessman. On the tapes, Marcello comes across as an old hand at buying politicians, a breed he despises but cultivates because of their influence. He emerges as a man who won't hesitate to offer a payoff, but only if he is sure to get back something of higher value. "You don't know about the fucking politicians," he tells Marinello on one tape. "Don't give 'em nothing until he produces something, man." He also says, "Everybody grabbing money and they don't know where they're going. They get all excited when they get money, man. And then they forget about you later." Marcello displays few of the stereotypes created by mafia movies. Nowhere in the investigation are rings kissed. There are no secret ceremonies, threats of violence, or offers of a deal you can't refuse. There is no Italian moralizing. There is no large retinue of lieutenants and bodyguards, only a secretary named Loretta Di Salvo, a brother, a chauffeur, and a lawyer, David Levy, who shares Marcello's office suite on Airline Highway. There is no massive mansion with elaborate security, merely a modest home in suburban old money Metairie, where Marcello complains, "They aristocrats and think they somebody. Their wives get drunk and get nothing for their husbands when they come home. A lot of times they are putting on because they don't have no money." No, Carlos Marcello of the tapes is too busy for trappings of overt power or for violence. He's too busy coldly calculating how to make more money. Since the days of Governor Huey Long, political corruption in Louisiana has traditionally been winked at. But if Marcello's own words on the tapes can be believed, corruption here may have become more widespread than even the state's sharpest critics during the 1952 Senate hearings claimed. "We got 2 big shots, man," Marcello triumphantly exclaims in a recorded 1979 telephone talk with his co-defendant, self-professed Washington arranger Davidson, 60, a fast-talking lobbyist who once sent Marcello a wooden Chinese carving of a god. He told Marcello it was a Ye Fu, which he said was Chinese for Godfather. No names were mentioned in the conversation, but prosecutors say it was plain that Marcello was referring to bribed politicians, and that they were Charles Romer, 58, of Baton Rouge, who was the powerful state commissioner of administration at the time, and Lieutenant Governo Rand, then gubernatorial candidate James Fitzmaurice. It was a feverish time in Louisiana. 6 candidates for governor were crisscrossing the state, spending over $20 million in the most expensive gubernatorial campaign. Marcello had handed out $45,000 in what prosecutors described as bribes to various candidates and their representatives. Romer took $25,000 in 2 separate payments, later saying he took the money as a contribution to the campaign of State Senator Edgar Mouton, whom Marcello was quietly supporting. Romer's lawyer says Romer was conning Marcello's emissaries, pretending to use his influence to trick them into bankrolling Mouton's candidacy. On another tape, Marinello says he delivered $10,000 to Fitzmaurice. His lawyers say it was a campaign contribution. Fitzmaurice denies ever receiving it. Hauser, who became Marcello's favorite during the FBI sting operation, also delivered $10,000 to gubernatorial candidate and public service commissioner Louis Lambert. Lambert refused to promise anything in return and made Hauser accept tickets to a fundraiser held the day before, a perfectly legal practice in Louisiana. On the tapes, Marcello is also heard claiming to have given money to Lieutenant Governor Robert Freeman. The tapes also have Marcello claiming influence with Jefferson Parish Sheriff Harry Lee and former Parish Council President Douglas Allen. Both men deny it, but Lee admits to duck hunting with Marcello, and both men have been guests at Marcello's Grand Isle fishing camp. Indeed, of all the politicians FBI agents and Hauser approached during the 6-month investigation, no one showed the operatives the door when they offered bribes. Some, like Fitzmaurice, offered simply to introduce them to people. Some, like Lambert, insisted that they wanted to stay within the law and not discuss illegal acts. But no one became indignant and threw them out. In Louisiana, explained ex-FBI agent Warren DeVries, director of the Metropolitan Crime Commission, they don't seem to look upon corruption in government the same way other parts of the country do. Still, on the tapes, Marcello pines for the old days when Louisiana was a wide-open state and dealing with politicians was much simpler. Reminiscing in an August 23, 1979, conversation with Marinello, Marcello recalls that he could do business with former governors Jimmy Davis and Earl Long. "It ain't like before, man. The gambling houses," Marcello muses. Nowadays, he complains, he must be circumspect. He tells of seeing former Governor Edwin Edwards in a coffee shop not long ago. "I looked away." Despite his boasts, the tapes show a more fallible side of Marcello, a long list of mistakes and comical errors that sound like scenes from the movie, The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight. Early on, he is heard telling someone, "I don't like to talk in my office, you never know." An FBI mic was hanging from his ceiling, recording every word. 3 times, agents picked the lock on his office door in the middle of the night to remove the bugs temporarily, because they had gotten word that Marcello planned to sweep the room for signs of surveillance. Marcello insists throughout the campaign that Mouton or Fitzmaurice will win. Mouton gets trounced, Fitzmaurice just misses a runoff spot, and Republican Dave Treen is elected governor, proving Marcello a less than impressive observer of state politics. If Marcello was fallible, so were the investigators. Once, the agents didn't have time to plant a bug on Hauser before a meeting because a waitress in the coffee shop of the Royal Orleans Hotel spilled orange juice on his toupee, forcing him to go change. Another time, the irrepressible Davidson grabbed a briefcase that concealed a recorder, remarked how heavy it was, and jokingly asked if a tape recorder was inside. Hauser quickly grabbed it away and handed it to one of the agents. Even when their alleged bribery plot began crumbling around them, Marcello couldn't believe it. When Young called him to warn him that a grand jury was investigating the insurance fraud, Marcello appeared skeptical and unconcerned. "Tell Roma we ain't gave him no money. Nobody gives him nothing. Just tell him ain't no money passed." "Nothing. No money," says Marcello. "Tell him, look, Carlos doesn't care if he gets subpoenaed 40 times. Tell them I just took the Fifth Amendment and that's it. They ain't gonna get a thing from me." He refuses even to consider Young's warning that Hauser might be a plant. "Forget about him, man. He ain't gonna say nothing." As for the agents, "Don't worry about dem. Dem guys are stronger than me. Okay?" As an obviously distressed Young continues to try to impress upon him the seriousness of their plight, Marcello, apparently unshaken, makes an abrupt suggestion. "You want to eat?" he asks. He proceeds to make arrangements at a local restaurant and ushers Young off for a steak. Carlos Marcello, 5 decades of crime born. Calogero Minacor in Tunis, Feb 6, 1910, sometimes known as Carlos Marcello. First arrested in 1929, first sentenced to prison 6 months later for assault and robbery. Pardoned after serving less than 5 years of a not less than 9 years sentence. Senora Estes Kefauver, chairman of the Senate Crime Committee, 1950. In my opinion, Marcello is one of the most sinister criminals encountered by the committee anywhere. He is building a criminal dynasty that may one day rival Al Capone's. In a separate comment, Kefauver called Marcello one of the worst hoodlums in the country, was number 18 on the Senate Crime Committee's 1952 list of 83 leading mafia members in the United States. Vito Genovese was number 1. In May 1975, Jack Anderson said the Defense Department bought over $1 million worth of tomatoes, strawberries, and cantaloupes from a firm whose top salesman is mafia godfather Carlos Marcello. 6 weeks later, a federal official confirmed the report. Quote by Marcello to House Crime Committee, June 1972. "I'm not in no rackets. I'm not in no organized crime." Marcello right, with attorney David Levy, who shares Marcello's office suite on Airline Highway. There is no massive mansion with elaborate security, merely a modest home in suburban Old Money, Metairie, where Marcello complains, "They aristocrats and think they somebody. Their wives get drunk and get nothing for their husbands when they come home. A lot of times they are putting on because they don't have no money." This next article comes from an old foe of Carlos Marcello, Jack Anderson. In the mid-70s, Anderson found himself embroiled in some serious issues. He was the journalist interviewing Johnny Roselli, exposing stories about the CIA's collaboration with the Mafia, and targeting figures like Carlos Marcello and Santo Trafficante. Each story he printed took shots at Jimmy Hoffa, Marcello, and the Southern Mafia. Years later, Frank Regano warned Anderson that his name had come up during discussions about a contract on his life, which was eventually shut down. Regano also told Anderson that he was the reason Johnny Roselli was killed. Organized crime wanted to find out who was leaking stories, and after Roselli's death, Anderson revealed to the press that Roselli had been his source. The Mafia figured this out and subsequently murdered Roselli. Despite the danger, Anderson continued to print stories about Carlos Marcello, especially after Trafficante's death and Marcello's imprisonment. Many documentaries can be found on YouTube about Jack Anderson, the Kennedy assassination, and the various paths he pursued to uncover the truth. This particular article, written by Anderson, delves into the power of organized crime and its intricate connections. In Washington, D.C., the FBI's undercover sting operation recently caught a startling assortment of politicians with itchy fingers. Among those ensnared was a 70-year-old grandfather from a quiet New Orleans suburb, identified as Carlos Marcello. Known as the Little Man, due to his 5'2" stature, this nickname is never used in his presence. "Everyone calls him Mr. Marcello," one associate assured. Carlos Marcello is the biggest little man in organized crime, commanding a $2 billion criminal empire that extends from Louisiana deep into Texas. The FBI had long struggled to infiltrate his operations, thwarted in wiretapping and informant recruitment. Except for a 1968 assault charge for hitting an FBI agent, they had been unable to pin anything on him. That changed when Joe Hauser, a twice-convicted businessman who had gained Marcello's trust, agreed to set him up for the FBI in exchange for a reduced prison term. Hauser recorded Marcello on hidden microphones, arranging to bribe Louisiana officials to secure a lucrative state insurance deal. Indicted, Marcello pleaded innocent and awaits trial, which promises to be one of the most memorable court dramas. Carlos Marcello's influence and operations have made him a legendary figure among the godfathers of organized crime in America. Despite his power, Marcello has managed to veil his activities so well that even his origins are shrouded in mystery. He is believed to have been born as Calogero Minocor on February 6, 1910, to Sicilian parents in Tunisia, North Africa, before being brought to New Orleans as an infant. His private life remains shadowy, and his dealings are secretive. Marcello is moon-faced and barrel-chested, his massive bulk belied by his short stature. He eschews the gaudy clothes and flashy jewelry typical of mobsters, instead presenting a rumpled appearance. His thinning hair and softened features conceal a wariness in his eyes, a slightly twisted nose, and a tight-lipped mouth that hint at his violent past. Though he lives quietly with his wife Jacqueline in a comfortable but not extravagant 3-bedroom house in Metairie, his daily routine reveals his deep involvement in crime. Marcello's daily life is meticulously orchestrated. He starts early with breakfast prepared by his confidant and cook, Donald Stone, before driving himself unaccompanied to his office in a Lincoln or Cadillac. His headquarters is a modest 5-room office near a shopping complex, its outer rooms resembling a real estate office with maps of his properties on display. Yet, hidden from view, are thousands of additional acres and enterprises under his control, including gambling, prostitution, narcotics, and other criminal activities. For lunch, Marcello often drops by the restaurant next door, joining some of his brothers for spicy Louisiana seafood dishes, despite chronic gout. He limits his drinking to a bottle of beer or a glass of wine. Occasionally, he entertains luncheon guests at his 5,000-acre Churchill Farms plantation, a secluded mansion that also serves as a venue for underworld dealings. By evening, he returns home for a meal cooked by his wife and is usually in bed by 10 in the afternoon. Marcello's social circle is small, mainly his family and his 6 brothers. Despite his criminal empire, he is described as a good husband and father to his 4 children and a doting grandfather to his grandchildren, whom he once took on a tour of Washington, D.C. while handling his immigration issues. However, sworn testimony before the New Orleans Crime Commission depicts Marcello as having corrupted public officials at every level, including police, sheriffs, prosecutors, mayors, governors, judges, councilmen, and legislators. Marcello's empire is vast and influential, with connections across the country. He is part of a national syndicate of organized crime families, each with its own territory and operations, from New York to Los Angeles, from Detroit to Tampa. Among the most powerful crime bosses, Marcello holds a unique position of prestige, independence, and authority. His operation, described as the most lucrative in the crime business, remains a testament to his skillful and secretive orchestration of a vast and dangerous underworld network. Carlos Marcello, a man who has eluded the U.S. legal system for 50 years, has been a formidable figure in organized crime. Despite his efforts to evade justice and his numerous run-ins with the law, Marcello remains a complex and influential character. Marcello's history of legal troubles began in 1930, when he was convicted of assault and robbery of a grocery store, receiving a 9 to 14-year prison sentence. However, thanks to powerful friends, he obtained an early pardon from then Louisiana Governor O.K. Allen. Later assault and robbery charges were never prosecuted, showcasing his influence. In 1938, federal authorities convicted him for narcotics peddling, but he served less than a year and paid a mere $400 fine by pleading poverty. Marcello's defiance continued with multiple contempt of Congress charges after refusing to answer questions before the Senate Crime Committee in 1951 and the House Select Crime Committee in 1972. Each time, he avoided imprisonment on technicalities. His resistance to the U.S. legal system extended to immigration efforts. In 1961, after being deported to Guatemala, he snuck back into the country. Although acquitted of falsifying his birth records, he faced further charges of jury bribery and a murder contract on a government witness. The latter dropped when the witness refused to testify. Marcello's empire, known as the Wall Street of the Cosa Nostra, holds a unique position within the national crime network. Unlike other families, Marcello did not need to clear his decisions with the Crime Commission, highlighting his unparalleled independence. Despite claiming to be a modest tomato salesman, Internal Revenue agents suspect he pays taxes on only a fraction of his vast income. Now presenting himself as an investor and land developer, Marcello claims assets of around $100 million. In his efforts to clear his name, Marcello has repeatedly denied any involvement in organized crime. At a Senate hearing in 1959, he stated, "I am not in no racket. I am not in no organized crime." In 1975, his attorneys sought to suspend federal deportation on grounds of good moral character. In a handwritten letter to Hugh Brean, Assistant Commissioner for Detention and Deportation, Marcello expressed his desire to spend his remaining days peacefully. "I have a family which includes 11 grandchildren, of which my adopted country can be proud. I have a number of businesses of which I and the community are very proud, and I have been a good taxpayer for a number of years. I am at a stage of life where it is tormenting to me to be under this supervision. I would like to spend the rest of my days with a clear head and mind, knowing that I have proved myself to my adopted homeland. I beg of you, and to those who are concerned with lifting this darkness from my head and heart, to please consider my request for its removal." Federal authorities denied his request, maintaining their stance against Marcello. His legacy, partly rooted in the history of the New Orleans mob, illustrates the deep ties of La Cosa Nostra in the United States. The New Orleans family, originating from Sicily in the 1880s, is respected as the predecessor of all subsequent families. Marcello's unique independence from the syndicate's powerful commission further cements his status within organized crime. Despite his pleas for leniency, Carlos Marcello's name remains synonymous with a lifetime of criminal activity, evasion, and unrelenting influence. The second part of Jack Anderson's report delves into organized crime groups across America, expanding beyond New Orleans and Chicago, and moving beyond a sole focus on Italian organizations. Anderson highlights the growing trend of various ethnic crime groups forming alliances, reminiscent of Charlie Luciano's earlier collaborations with Irish, Jewish, and other minority gangs. This phenomenon, which gained significant traction in the 1970s and 1980s, actually began much earlier. One pivotal moment was when Meyer Lansky moved operations into Havana, Cuba, and Frank Costello shifted operations to New Orleans. In New Orleans, the French Corsican Mafia held sway, and in Cuba, the Cuban Mafia was prominent. Across Asia, other heavyweight organized crime groups were major players in narco-trafficking. However, many of these groups, notably the French Corsican Mafia, experienced significant downfalls, especially in the 1960s, when they were nearly wiped out. Following this decline, a strong connection formed between Mexican organized crime groups and the Italian Mafia. This partnership began well before the 1970s, spearheaded by Carlos Marcello in New Orleans. Marcello's men were remarkably innovative in their drug smuggling operations, using planes, boats, and even parachute drops to bring drugs into America. They employed diverse methods, including sending college students across the Mexican border to bring back caravans filled with drugs. These operations were executed with such precision that hundreds of thousands of trips were made without arrests. The primary drug routes into America often passed through Miami and the southern regions, including New Orleans and Arkansas, areas under the control of Marcello's network. This section of Anderson's report also touches on aspects of Black history, illustrating the broad and diverse impact of organized crime on various communities and historical narratives. From 1975 to 1979, California witnessed a significant increase in organized crime activities, marked by 20 contract killings over 4 years. These killings were not random acts of violence, but carefully orchestrated hits targeting organized crime figures, federal grand jury witnesses, and known mafia informers. These events signify the growth of mob activity from a small presence to a pervasive influence across the state. Growth of mob influence. According to federal, state, and local authorities, these murders document the spread of organized crime throughout California. The infiltration by Midwest and East Coast mafia families has transformed the state into a lucrative hub for illicit activities, with an estimated worth of up to $10 billion annually. The California Department of Justice reports that in the past 5 years, 50 known syndicate leaders, primarily from New York and Chicago, have either moved into or heavily invested in California. Connections to Mexico. This influx of organized crime also includes significant ties to Mexico. Federal authorities have indicated that East Coast and Midwest mobsters are heavily involved in smuggling narcotics from and through Mexico. These syndicates have established legitimate businesses in Mexico, potentially as fronts for illicit operations, and have forged direct connections with top Mexican narcotics traffickers. Political and police protection in Mexico, along with highly mobile and flexible operations, allow these syndicates to operate with minimal interference from Mexican authorities. Key figures and operations. Some key organized crime figures linked to Mexico and operating in California include Vincent Albanese of Chula Vista, involved in arms smuggling into Mexico in exchange for heroin. John Alessio, who resides in La Mesa and Tijuana, has extensive ties in Mexico. Frank Bompensiero, killed in 1977, was involved in narcotics smuggling and associated with major Mexican traffickers. Louis Tom Dragna of Covina, involved in various illicit activities, including narcotics and illegal alien smuggling. James Fratiano, under federal protection after providing extensive information about the mob. Angelo Marino of San Jose, who uses his cheese company as a front for narcotics smuggling. California's organized crime structure. California's organized crime is unique in that it operates without a single designated boss, making it an open territory for out-of-state mobsters to establish rackets without fear of territorial wars. Historically, the state has been divided into 3 crime areas: Southern California, San Jose, and San Francisco. The last known leader of the Southern California family was Nick Licata, who died in 1974. Possible successors include Dominic Bruglia and Louis Tom Dragna. Joseph Cherito led the San Jose family until his death in 1978, with no clear successor emerging. James Lanza, an elderly San Mateo resident, leads the San Francisco family, although his influence appears to be waning. Potential leaders and future outlook. Several figures are poised to potentially consolidate power in California. Vincent Albanese of Chula Vista, known for moving mob money and working with various crime figures. John Alessio, a former racetrack operator and land developer with substantial ties in Mexico. Anthony Spilotro, an underboss in the Chicago organization, though his position is weakened by several mistakes. Palm Springs, a mob haven. Palm Springs has become a notable exception to the trend of mobsters settling in metropolitan areas, attracting about 50 known mafia leaders, primarily from Chicago. These figures have invested heavily in the community, estimated at $50 million to $200 million. Palm Springs serves as a neutral area where crimes are planned but not executed, allowing mobsters to avoid local law enforcement scrutiny. Louis Tom Dragna. Law enforcement officials believe Louis Tom Dragna may be a leading contender as the boss of the Southern California Mafia. A native, Dragna has been associated with organized crime figures for most of his 59 years. He owns Roberta Manufacturing Company in Rosemead, a Los Angeles suburb, and has interests in L. Joe Styles and hidden ownership in several other garment firms. Federal and state authorities link him to bookmaking gambling and smuggling illegal aliens from Mexico to work in garment shops. Officers suspect he has a vast network of narcotics trafficking, although detailed information is scarce. Dragna is the nephew of the late Jack Dragna, former Southern California Mafia boss until 1957. He has high-ranking Mafia affiliations confirmed by the California Assembly Subcommittee on Rackets, the California Organized Crime Control Commission, and the U.S. Congressional Record. His associates include Joseph Sica, the late Frank Bompensiero, Peter Licavoli, Anthony Accardo, James Fratianno, and the late Mickey Cohen. James Fratianno, nicknamed Jimmy the Weasel. Fratianno has become the FBI's highest-ranking Mafia informant since Joe Valachi. The 66-year-old former Fresno resident is under federal protective custody. Fratianno headed a ring importing cocaine, heroin and marijuana from Mexico before making a deal with the government for a reduced prison sentence. The ring included major Mexican narcotics trafficker Ramon Jaime. Fratianno has convictions for robbery, extortion, making false statements, and conspiracy. Los Angeles police described him as the executioner for the West Coast mob. Salvatore Pizzello, a member of the Gambino family of New York, Pizzello is a suspected narcotics smuggler for the Carmine Consalvo crime organization. According to a DEA report, Pizzello was named by Mexican narcotics dealer Jorge Asaf Ibala as his New York heroin customer. Pizzello maintains a home in Lake Encino, Los Angeles, and has been linked to organized crime figures Edward Lino and Charles Alaimo. Authorities believe Pizzello is emerging as a key figure in narcotics smuggling between Mexico and U.S. buyers. John Alessio, 68, maintains homes in Tijuana and La Mesa, a San Diego suburb. He has been involved in the ownership of racetracks in New Mexico and Mexico, controlling a vast network of gambling, narcotics, and bookmaking activities. Alessio spent 2 years in federal prison for income tax evasion. Federal sources have described the Sunland Park racetrack in New Mexico as a major narcotics distribution center. Alessio's connections span both sides of the border, making him a significant force in California's organized crime scene. Bert Sparacino, a former operator of Jeannie Bail Bond Agency in San Diego, has close ties with Hell's Angels and is involved in narcotics smuggling. Authorities link him to Frank Bompensiero and Angelo Marino. Sparacino's criminal record includes convictions for hit-and-run driving, displaying a weapon, and battery. Vincent Albanese, 48, of Southern California, is a significant mover of mob money. He is associated with Y&V Development in San Diego and has been involved in construction projects in San Diego and Palm Springs. Authorities suspect Albanese of smuggling arms into Mexico in exchange for heroin. He has ties to organized crime figures in 4 states and has invested heavily in California. Michelle Marchese, 57, of Pasadena, has been an enforcer for organized crime in Los Angeles. He has convictions for violating federal narcotics laws, extortion, and possession of a firearm by a felon. Authorities believe Marchese is involved in narcotics, gambling, and loan sharking. Joseph Sica. Joseph Sica, the leader of the Sica brothers, has a lengthy arrest record for robbery, grand theft auto, larceny, bookmaking, and extortion. Sica pioneered the establishment of a narcotics network between California and Mexico. He and his brothers are currently involved in bookmaking and loan sharking. Carl Hammett, former president of the Hells Angels in San Diego, has links to mafia figures in California and Michigan. Authorities allege he is involved in smuggling weapons into Mexico in exchange for narcotics and has connections to the Iron Horseman motorcycle gang. Edward Zuber, currently in federal prison, has been identified as a Los Angeles area organized crime figure. He has been linked to Meyer Lansky, Sam Cagnina, and Santos Traficante. Authorities believe Zuber is still active in narcotics trafficking. Angelo Marino, a high-ranking member of the San Jose Mafia, owns California Cheese Company and allegedly uses it as a front for narcotics smuggling. He has connections with the Hells Angels for transporting drugs and has been linked to numerous mafia leaders across the country. Frank Lambert, former owner of Lambert Incorporated, was convicted of smuggling marijuana from Mexico. He is believed to be involved in narcotics smuggling again and has connections with top Mexican narcotics traffickers and California organized crime figures. Anthony J. Giacalone, a ranking member of the Detroit Mafia hierarchy, has been involved in Mexican heroin trafficking. Known as Tony Jack, he has a criminal record dating back 25 years and has been linked to the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa. Charles V. Carollo, brother of Kansas City. Crime figure Sam Carollo has been involved in narcotics trafficking for 30 years. As a member of the Appropriations Committee's Subcommittee on Foreign Operations, he has actively engaged with Mexican authorities to reinforce the control programs. After a visit to Mexican growing areas, he successfully reinstated $12 million in the U.S. budget for narcotics control in Mexico. De Concini remains optimistic about further reducing the heroin flow from Mexico. He acknowledges the skepticism from some U.S. officials, but argues that his interactions with Mexican counterparts show a genuine commitment to shedding the country's reputation as a heroin hub. The aid provided is structured through direct purchases and pilot training, ensuring effective use of funds. During a recent visit to Mexico, De Concini sought assurances from Mexican Congress members about the continuity of their anti-trafficking efforts. They confirmed their commitment to ongoing operations, which bodes well for continued progress in reducing heroin trafficking into the United States. The days of the old-timers in organized crime were coming to an end. The fall of Carlos Marcello, the decline of the front bosses in New York, the collapse of the Florida and Miami connections, and the deaths of many mobsters from the old world of organized crime marked this transition. Many of these men never died the inside of a prison cell. Charlie Luciano died a free man, as did Frank Costello, Carlos Marcello, Russell Bufalino, Tony Accardo, Paul Ricca, and other members of the Chicago outfit who had run operations since the Prohibition days. Santo Traficante Sr. and Jr., as well as his family members, never went to prison. Myalansky, Mo Dalitz, and Joe Zerilli also died free men. Over the years, these men had put up front bosses to maintain control. After the fall of Sam Giancana, Tony the Ant Spilotro began to take over the rackets. Starting in the late 60s and mastering his craft by the 70s and 80s, Spilotro became a significant figure in organized crime, practically running Las Vegas. He was a key player, answering to powerful people and ensuring operations ran smoothly. Spilotro managed casinos in Las Vegas and, once everything was in order, would take a private jet to places like Texas or California to oversee other operations. He was responsible for ensuring these operations, run by the Chicago outfit and the Southern Mafia, were efficient. If there were any issues, he handled them with ruthless efficiency, breaking necks and killing when necessary to get the job done. By the 80s, he had become a powerhouse, having built his reputation and influence over the past 15 years. This article delves into his history and will further explore the Chicago outfit. In 1971, the Chicago Mafia began a concerted push westward, filling a leadership vacuum in Las Vegas, Nevada, and Southern California. The man chosen to spearhead the mob's drive was Anthony Spilotro. They called him Tony the Ant, but never to his face. He was feared as the syndicate's chief enforcer and executioner. Today he is a suspect in the murder or disappearance of at least 25 people who posed a threat to the mob's ambitions in the West. Operating out of Las Vegas, Spilotro aggressively extended the Chicago syndicate's dominion into Southern California, where his underlings have become active in murder for hire, arson, burglary, bookmaking, drug dealing, extortion, and loan sharking, according to federal and local law enforcement authorities. This is the story of how it happened. Anthony John Spilotro was making his move. After 10 years as a loyal street soldier in the Chicago crime syndicate, his dedication was finally paying off. Federal agents watched from across the street as the household possessions of Spilotro, his wife Nancy, and their 4-year-old son Vincent were carted from their suburban duplex and loaded into a van. Destination: Las Vegas. "He's coming your way, Mike," Chicago FBI agent Duncan Everett told his Nevada counterpart, Michael G. Simon, in a message. "Looks like to stay. I'll pass on what I have." It was 1971. At the time, FBI agents thought Spilotro was another ambitious mafia punk, probably sent west as an errand boy for the mob-connected big shots and casino bosses on the Las Vegas Strip. Nothing nasty was expected of Spilotro, though. The national collection of mafia families with casino interests in Las Vegas had an understanding. Make money, not waves. But times change. More mafia-style murders occurred in Nevada between 1971 and 1974 than during the previous 25 years, a study by the Los Angeles Times in 1974 revealed. For example, a casino executive and his wife were gunned down in front of their apartment. Another casino executive was rubbed out in a busy parking lot. A prominent lawyer was blown up in his Cadillac. A loan shark victim disappeared. A wealthy investor was murdered in her home, but nothing of value apparently was taken. Another hotel casino executive was crippled for life as a lesson. Las Vegas old-timers, veterans of East Coast 1930s gang wars, told the Times, "Somebody's trying to move in. We've had at least 5 unsolved Shylock, loan shark murders since that guy got here," a Las Vegas detective said then, referring to Spilotro. Whether Spilotro was responsible became moot. Casino insiders, the police and federal agents were convinced the murders were his doing. "Every time there was a hit, we'd rush out to Spilotro's house," recalled retired Las Vegas Police Lieutenant Don Charlebois, who specialized in organized crime during the 1970s. "Little Tony would always be sitting there waiting for us, polite as you please. 'Hi, fellas. Come on in,' he'd say. 'Have a seat. Can I get you something? Should I call my lawyer?' By 1977, when the federal government fully realized what Spilotro was all about, Tony the Ant, as he came to be called behind his back, would be credited with building a criminal empire where one never had existed. To the aging mafia dons who ruled him from 1,700 miles to the east, Spilotro remained a trusted soldier who reported to a capo captain in their highly regimented family of more than 200 members. In Las Vegas, he was considered the watchdog for Chicago mob interests in at least 5 casinos. But Spilotro had other aspirations. He recruited a gang of master burglars, loan sharks, bookies and enforcers, many imported from Chicago and the East, and the Ya. They moved westward into California. Some were arrested and convicted, but others came to take their place. Spilotro's Las Vegas jewelry store, the Gold Rush, became the center of a burglary ring fed by crews working in Los Angeles, Orange County, San Diego, Phoenix, and Chicago, according to FBI affidavits and wiretaps. The Gold Rush became Spilotro's Fort Knox, offering both a place to protect his wealth and security from government spying. FBI agents later charged in affidavits that the Gold Rush was a veritable warehouse of stolen jewelry and that 70% of the inventory came from a nationwide burglary and fencing ring. As his hold in Las Vegas grew, Spilotro's gang infiltrated the organized crime unit of the Las Vegas police, spied electronically on the FBI, and intimidated public officials all the way to Nevada's capital in Carson City. After being arrested one August morning in 1972 in Las Vegas on a murder warrant from Chicago, Spilotro used a police officer as a gopher to arrange his release. Spilotro's lieutenants, testimony has it, committed murder, arson, and hundreds of robberies and burglaries. They robbed dope dealers and sold the narcotics themselves. They established a multi-million-dollar bookmaking and loan sharking ring in San Diego, Orange, and Los Angeles counties in California. They have been seen with increasing frequency in the poker casinos of Bell and Gardena and at mob hangouts in the San Fernando Valley and Los Angeles' West Side. Bookmaking, burglary, and loan sharking seem to top their agenda. They are part of an empire built largely on fear of the man considered to be the West Coast's chief mafia executioner. No living underworld figure in Nevada or California has dared to stand up to Spilotro. Intimidation has been his forte. Spilotro himself has been arrested, questioned, and publicly accused, but never convicted in at least 25 mob-style executions since 1960, many marked by the same trademark. Shots fired at close range into the eardrum, mouth, and forehead from a small-caliber pistol fitted with a silencer. Those who vanished or were murdered included Tamara Rand, a San Diego socialite businesswoman; Johnny Pappas, a former aide to a Nevada governor; Sam DeStefano, a Spilotro co-defendant in a 1960s murder trial; Rick Manzi, husband of singer Barbara McNair; Daniel Seifert, a key government witness; Gerald Covelli, a government witness living in Encino, California; plus several Los Angeles high rollers, 2 mob kingpins, 4 loan sharks, 3 Nevada casino executives, and numerous underworld individuals. None of the murders has been solved. In almost every case, the victim posed a threat to Spilotro or the Chicago mob. Spilotro, 44, started his crime career as a teenager with misdemeanor convictions for possession of burglary tools, loitering, larceny, disorderly conduct, and punching a Chicago police officer. He was convicted in absentia for a $200,000 hotel room burglary in Monte Carlo. He was convicted of federal home loan fraud in Chicago. He was tried and acquitted of a 1963 torture murder despite a professed eyewitness. He is awaiting a crucial extradition hearing in Nevada on Wednesday on 2 other Chicago torture murders from 1962. But this time, the case is based largely on what an informer claims Spilotro told him.